Well, guys, we finally made it to the final chapter. Here's chapter 56, all about conservation biology and global change. We have had a long and fact-filled journey in Bio 1306 and Bio 1307. We started talking about some of the smallest components of biology in biological molecules, and then we've moved our way up slowly all the way to talking about the entire biosphere and the entire planet Earth. And if we ever do find life on another planet, we'll even have to add and enlarge our scope of biology to include life on other planets. So we're going to end with conservation biology and global change. I wouldn't say that this is the most upbeat and optimistic chapter of everything that we're going to study this year, because it does talk quite a bit about some of the negative impacts that human activity has had on the earth, but it also talks about some of the ways that we could potentially repair that or do things differently. So it is somewhat hopeful at the very end if you have an optimistic mindset. And we will get started in just 1 second with our final chapter of Bio 1307. A quick overview of this chapter. It says striking gold, and that's because it talks about a particular bird that you'll see in just a moment. It says scientists have named and described 1.8 million species. That's an approximate number, and of course that is a huge number. It's a very large number, but that is nothing compared to the actual number of living species on our planet. There's really no way to accurately estimate that number, but biologists estimate anywhere between 10 to 100 million species exist on Earth. You can see that's a huge range from 10 to 100 million, but of course that also takes into account all the various varieties and species of bacteria, and of course there are many insects and things of that nature. So I would say we have a fairly decent handle on large mammals and creatures of that size, but when it comes to the smaller animals, reptiles and smaller insects, and then of course when it gets to the microorganisms, there will be many millions of species that we will probably never count or accurately name and study and that type of thing. A good example of where you can find all these species would be tropical rainforests. We know that tropical rainforests hold a great diversity of life. They contain some of the greatest concentrations of species diversity, and unfortunately this is another good example of man's impact on the earth, because tropical rainforests are one of those areas that are being destroyed at a fairly alarming rate, and this has been going on for, I would say, particularly in the last 50 years. Humans are rapidly pushing many species toward extinction, and of course there are many hundreds and probably thousands of species that go extinct prior to us even being able to categorize them and recognize them. So we are losing species that we don't even know about, and of course there are probably many instances where those species have an important position to play, an important niche to play in their ecosystem, and then of course there are some times where those species could have been important to us in a variety of ways, and we're going to discuss that throughout this chapter. So why is this overview called Striking Gold? Well, that's because of this little bird that they discuss in the book there. It says, what will be the fate of this newly described bird? This is a bird they call the wattled smoky honeyeater, and it has this kind of golden area around its eye here. It's a species found in Indonesia, and it was never actually described or cataloged by science before 2005. So even up into the modern day times, 2005, this is a fairly large distinctive bird, but because it lives in a very remote area of Indonesia, it has gone undetected for no telling how long, however long it's been alive, or however long the species has existed. So even today we still find numerous species every year, and again this is of a larger creature, not even including things like insects and microorganisms. But going back to the book, here's a good example of where this bird might live in the forests of Indonesia, in the rainforests of Indonesia. This is a typical picture of some of the tropical deforestation going on in Indonesia. This is a part of Indonesia called the West Kalimantan province, and you can see where man's activity basically is wiping out this forest, creating roads, creating farmland, and doing away with a lot of ecosystems, and thus doing away with a lot of species diversity in this part of the world. So what can we do about this? What can we do to try to conserve these resources, these species, these ecosystems? Well, the study of all of that is called conservation biology, and that seeks to preserve life and integrates several fields. It's kind of like a combination of numerous separate studies or separate areas of study. You have ecology, physiology, molecular biology, genetics, evolutionary biology. All of that is combined together to form this idea or this concept of conservation biology, which does its best to try to preserve life, preserve species diversity. Humans have altered nearly half of the Earth's land surface already, and we use more than half of all accessible fresh water. So as a singular species, we have a major impact on the planet, and we have a major impact on millions of other species of living creatures. Conservation biology tries to reverse some of that impact, or at least limit some of that impact. We're going to start right here with concept 56.1. It says human activities threaten Earth's biodiversity, and this is the downer part of the chapter because there is no doubt that human activity has been detrimental to the Earth in many respects and many aspects. Rates of species extinction are difficult to determine under natural conditions, and so we can't say with pinpoint accuracy the exact number of species that we're losing, but through various methods of study we can get a fairly decent estimate. Of course, extinction, the loss of species, is a natural process, and that has been occurring since life began on Earth. Obviously, creatures like the dinosaurs and millions of other species are no longer with us, and they used to be here. So extinction is nothing new, and it's certainly a part of the natural world, and it would go on even if we weren't present. But it's not extinction per se that's so worrying, it's the rate of species extinction. And the current high rate of species extinction is largely the result of ecosystem degradation by humans. It's directly related to human activity, and certainly humans are threatening Earth's biodiversity. When we talk about that word biodiversity, we really mean three things, or three types or levels of biodiversity. We can look at genetic diversity within a particular group, a species. We can look at species diversity within a particular ecosystem, and then we can look at ecosystem diversity over the entire planet. So basically three layers or levels. If we're looking at a particular species, like if we're looking at orangutans, well, we might want to study genetic diversity amongst a group of orangutans because that becomes important. If we're looking at an entire forest, we might look at the species diversity within that forest. And if we're thinking about the entire Earth, we might want to think about all of the various ecosystems and the diversity of those across the Earth. So your book always has a great example of having illustrations. So here's just a quick illustration to kind of show those levels. Here is, we're talking about voles. Voles are little rodent type creatures. So we could look at the population of voles and we might want to understand their genetic diversity. We might want to understand the species diversity in the coastal redwood ecosystem, which is the forest system where he lives. And then we might want to understand community and ecosystem diversity across the entire North American continent or the entire northern hemisphere of the planet, something like that. So basically three different levels of diversity we should be concerned with. The first level of diversity we should look at would be the most stringent, or the smallest level, the lower level of diversity would be genetic diversity between a particular population. Genetic diversity comprises genetic variation within a population and between populations. So if we look at all of the tigers that live in a particular jungle, we would want to know what is their genetic diversity between those individual tigers. How much are they alike or not alike within their DNA? Species diversity is the next step up. That would be the variety of species in a particular ecosystem or area. So if we're looking at the entire Indonesian jungle in a particular area, we would want to know what are the number and kind of species that live there. According to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, we can kind of define species in a couple different ways if they are potentially becoming more rare. The first one is called an endangered species, and that is, quote, in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of its range, unquote. So that would be the highest level of concern. If you are considered an endangered species, that means you may not be around for too much longer if things continue the way they are. A secondary level, which is not quite as bad, would be called a threatened species, and that is a species that is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So you're not currently considered endangered, but you are of a concern. The number of your species is of a concern, habitat loss is of a concern, and if things continue, you would fall onto the endangered list, which could then eventually lead to extinction. When you talk to conservation biologists and we study this idea of extinction, like I said, it goes on constantly. It's a natural part of the biological world, but conservation biologists are concerned about the current species loss because of alarming statistics regarding the rate of extinction and the loss of biodiversity. Globally, 12% of birds, 21% of mammals, and 32% of amphibians are considered threatened with extinction. In other words, we would think of them as either a threatened or endangered species. So there's a large percentage of the life on our planet that is under the gun, so to speak, that is in danger of potentially going extinct. Extinction can be considered local or global. You could have a species go extinct in a particular area and not exist in a particular area, or you could have, of course, what would be the absolute worst, which would be global extinction. Means game over, you're done, that species is gone. And there are plenty of examples of creatures that have gone extinct for good. Classic examples, of course, include like the dodo bird and the passenger pigeon, and then of course you can think about the dinosaurs themselves, Tyrannosaurus rex, and many others much closer to our current time period as well. So global extinction means that's it, none of your species can be found throughout the entire planet. Local extinction means the gene pool shrinks and survival is certainly going to be threatened in the long term. Here's 3 modern day examples of creatures that are very close to extinction. These are 3 members of what famed biologist E.O. Wilson calls the 100 Heartbeat Club, because each of these species have fewer than 100 individuals still left on Earth. So you have this Philippine eagle, you have the Yangtze River dolphin, the Javan rhinoceros. These are creatures who are barely hanging on as a species. Their numbers are so low that it's highly likely that they will be extinct in the fairly near future. The third and final type of diversity we want to look at, the larger overall kind of picture diversity, is ecosystem diversity. If you look at the entire continent of North America or even the entire world, you want to look at ecosystem diversity and what human impact has done to that. Human activity has reduced ecosystem diversity, which is the variety of ecosystems in the biosphere. And a good example would be wetlands. More than 50% of wetlands in the contiguous U.S. have been drained and converted to other ecosystems. The United States of America used to have a fair number of acres of wetlands, which is a very important ecosystem for a wide variety of different creatures, but many of those wetlands have been drained and modified, are now used as farmland, grazing land, things of that nature, or even human civilization, where we have drained that and built roads and cities and malls and things like that where there used to be wetlands. Think about the Florida Everglades, which of course now a portion of that is protected, but the Everglades used to take over a much larger quantity of what is now Florida, but we have certainly drained and modified quite a bit of that. So ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems in the biosphere, and we have reduced that through our activity. When we think about the reduction of species or the loss of biodiversity, it's sometimes you think about, well, that one species, but we have to always keep in mind that in biology everything is connected. All living things are interconnected in a wide variety of ways. So the local extinction of one species can have a negative impact on many of the other species in the ecosystem because of food chains and energy transfer for that and other reasons. A great example is flying foxes, which are a type of bat. They are very important pollinators and seed dispersers on various Pacific islands. So here you see this bat, he is getting some of the nectar out of the flowers. So just like a bumblebee or a hummingbird, many flowers are pollinated by bats, and they are pollinated, the pollen is spread from flower to flower, plant to plant by bats instead of, say, like bees that we might usually think of. Well, if there's a problem with these flying fox bats, if their number drops, that's going to be a problem for these plants that rely on them for pollination. So there's all this interconnectedness between living creatures, and when one of the links of the chain is broken, you're going to have ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem. We're going to take a break right there, and we're going to come back and talk about biodiversity and human welfare. As harsh as it may sound, a lot of people may ask, well, what does this have to do with me? What do I care if this bat goes extinct and this plant suffers because it doesn't have a pollinator? Well, we're going to try to bring it back to the impact on humans, this loss of biodiversity, not just the emotional and sort of we have this emotional tie, and we have this natural feeling that we even have a word for. We're going to talk about it in just a moment. But there is also direct impacts on us as far as our use of these creatures and our use of the planet and what we can benefit from. So we'll tie it back to that in just a second. We'll be right back.